In this episode of Idioms of Normality, brought to you by Future Frame TV, I speak with Professor Greg Downey, where we talk about human diversity and the price we pay for our normality. Welcome to another episode of Idioms of Normality, brought to you by Future Framed TV. Today I have the pleasure to be talking with Professor Greg Downey. Professor, thank you very much for being with us.
Thanks, Paul. It's good to be here.
Before I jump into the first question, which is what is normal, I'd like to ask you, what are the perspectives and experiences that you bring to this question?
Well, I'm an anthropologist, so I study human cultural diversity, but I'm also a neuroanthropologist, so I study neurological and psychological variation across cultures. And my own experience has been really shaped by field work. I went to Brazil and did field research. Also I've done a field school in Fiji, travel, working with other people, but also by teaching. I teach at Macquarie University, and I think I've been teaching now for over 20 years. Is that right? 25 years? Oh, God. 25 years I've been teaching in the States and Australia, and just coming into contact with a lot of people, both as graduate students and undergraduates, and seeing the way they think, and really exposing myself to a variety of humans that are out there.
So that's a lot of students in multiple contexts.
Yeah, a lot of students.
So let's jump in. What is normal?
Oh, look, it's such a hard question. I mean, normal is a concept, the idea that somehow we can put our finger on what's average and that's something meaningful. So I think, it comes out of statistics and it comes out of a particular moment in history. But I think the way it's sort of bled into popular discussions, the way it's bled into the way we talk about things like mental health or our bodies or all kinds of other things, it's the idea that somehow the average is what most people are. It's obviously not true. But for example, I ask you what's a normal color? Which is the normal color? You say that doesn't make any sense.
That's a great way of inverting the question. Yeah. What is a normal color?
Yeah. What is a normal color? Or what's the normal sex? And we know that doesn't make sense, And we know also that for a long time in our history, one sex was considered to be the norm or the normal. And it really changed, and it affected how we treat women. It affected medicine. It affected the way we employ people, how education works, even how religion and ideology works. So I think normal is the idea that somehow in any group of people, there's like an average, and the average is what most people are. And both of those things are fundamentally untrue. Not only is it that every group doesn't have this sometimes groups have different sorts of distributions where there's actually 2 or 3 or 4 types, or the idea that somehow normal has a value. If I said to you, I want only normal students, you would say, oh, I thought we were looking for exceptional students. Aren't we trying to find their unique skills? Aren't we trying to direct each one into the discipline or the skill or the profession that they'll do best at? So I think the idea of normal is that there's something valued in that. And it's especially difficult because I look a lot at evolution and human variation across cultures. And people tend to assume that the normal is like themselves.
Right.
I'm normal. Because it's got a value judgment. And I get people saying I'm abnormal. There's a way that you can use that as well when you sort of self-present. Most people think they're normal. But if you look across the whole of humanity, it's very hard to put a finger on what's normal. And if you look across our evolution, it's even harder. So, for example, if you're living in Australia or the United States or Western Europe, and you say, well, I have average salary, I'm the average, same age as the average person in my society, I belong to the majority religion, I speak the same language as most of the people around me. If you start looking globally, that falls apart immediately. That it's so not the rule. Yeah.
So if normal is not true, but it still exists as an extant category in medicine, in university, in different structures that we have in society, how does this roll out in society?
Look, it's a design principle, you could say, that we design for the average. And that's really dangerous. I run into a lot. I work with some visually impaired people quite a bit in my field research. And as they point out, accessibility is treated as though it's something for people with disability who are unusual or weird. But a lot of things that they need are useful to everyone. So, for example, getting into a building, well, the normal person can walk into the building, somebody in a wheelchair can't. And then, well, we design for what's normal. But in fact, once you start putting ramps in, all kinds of people realize that ramps are actually really useful.
Right.
There's times when you want to roll your luggage out. There's times when you've got your older relatives who have a hard time with steps. There's times when you just come back from a workout and you don't want to go up the steps, because you can't move your legs. So I think that there's a design principle that normal is rolled out as, we're going to focus on this imaginary, fictional, mythological, normal person, and then we'll just make sure that our product or our system, our computer software, our class design works for that person, and anybody who needs something different is weird. And in fact, a lot of people need something different. And we're just looking at things like education and realizing that, education was designed in one way, and it was assumed that everybody could just sort of slot into that system. But that system turns out to not work for a lot of people very well, and we lose a lot of talent that way. We get people who, they may not function really well in that system where children are expected to sit for a certain amount of time, and lessons have to be, you have to be still, or you have to look at a book, and you can't interrupt, and things like that. It turns out that for some children that imposes such a burden on them that they end up thinking that they're not capable, and they wind up dropping out of that system. But in fact, all they're doing is coming into a conflict with a system that was designed for this fictional, standard, normal child, when in fact kids are really varied.
If education is very much embroiled with this concept, normality, even though on the surface it might not appear that way, when we dig deep down, we'll find that there are these categories which can be quite abusive to people who don't quite fit into those categories. What does it mean to be abnormal in these categories?
Look, abnormal can be in certain places so stigmatized, and it's really unfair. It's a particular treatment of variation, and we know that variation is normal. You aren't the same height as your siblings. You aren't the same in terms of your ability to do certain tasks, athletic or sensory or psychological or cognitive. And we know that variation is in fact the rule. In fact, going back to sort of evolutionary principles, the only way you get a group of people that doesn't have variation is by cloning them. Right. And even then you're still going to have variation, because even the clones are not going to grow up in the same households and have the same influences.
So if variation is the rule and not the exception, how did we end up with a system that is seemingly obsessed with normality?
Well, we could talk about historical reasons. There's a historical reason why when states created standardized militaries, standardized, hospitals, standardized education system, there was a sense that you needed a norm, because you had to understand, whether, I'm just thinking about, for example, in France, as certain systems were rolled out, what was normal French? French varied all across France. So, but we need a system. We're going to have a state. If we're going to have a strong central state and all the soldiers are going to be able to talk to each other, they have to speak the same language. That was an ideology. So I think normal has crept in intentionally in those kind of projects, whether it's state building or whether it's the creation of our education system is arguably designed more to produce workers than to produce excellence in education. Right. It's designed to discipline kids, to socialize them, to indoctrinate them. When the wealthy 200 years ago were talking about public education, 150 years ago really, we're talking about public education, and they were buying into the idea that poor kids should get educated. They weren't doing it so the kids could achieve their potential in life. They were doing it because they thought, if we don't teach these working class kids some manners, if we don't teach them some respect, then they're going to be unruly. They're going to get drunk a lot. They're going to misbehave. They're going to join unions. They're going to work against us. So school has always been about, and a lot of our social institutions have two sides. Yeah, there's a benevolent side, but there's also this side of imposing a particular model. We want you to be a particular way, a good Christian or a good Chinese person or a good soldier or whatever it is. And so the norm is kind of a way of saying the ideal that we have for you is what you should also aspire to.
On the one hand, I want to ask you, who are the arbiters of these notions of normality? On the other hand, I also want to ask the consumers of normality, embroiled in that we're enmeshed in that relationship of co-constructing normality.
I think so, because I think when you come to a place like a school or a mental health program or a church or a sporting club, you kind of are looking for you're looking for support, but you're also looking for what is my standard? What should I aspire to? What role do I have here? What's a good thing for me to do? And so when the psychology department comes in and says this is a good thing to do, or when your church comes in and says to be a good man or to be a good woman is X, I think for a lot of people, especially as they find their feet, that's reassuring. So we conspire in the imposition of these standards on us. We say, yes, I want good grades. Yes, I want to I want to get kudos from my teacher, from my Sunday school teacher. Yes, I want to have the coach recognize me as a hardworking, good member of the team, or I want my boss to give me a good evaluation. But we all know, and as I give those examples, you all know that there's a kind of behind that velvet glove of we want you to succeed, there's a bit of a fist of, and if you don't, we're going to make you suffer. Whether it's we're going to fail you, or we're going to give you a bad performance review, or we're going to condemn your behavior for being unholy.
I really like that phrase. We conspire in the imposition of these standards upon us, and there seems to be these sticks and carrots.
Absolutely, and I think this is one of the things we can talk about different theorists, but I won't get into it. But the idea that for a long time, I think people saw power as purely sort of aggressive and sort of restricting you from doing things. Power was the government telling you, you cannot do X. You cannot drive a certain speed. That's what power looks like. But we also realize now that in a lot of systems, what power looks like is you should want to be like this. And you should want to be like this person on Instagram. You should want to be like this person in a sitcom. Your family should look like this. If it doesn't, maybe there's something wrong with you,
A lot of these values sold to us through normality.
Look, I think we live in a consumer society, but even before consumerism was so big, whether it was religion or states, they all have this thing of trying to create anxiety in you if you're different. If you are different, you should be anxious.
There's a self-policing element to that.
Absolutely, and there have always been people who can sort of say, I don't care, and they walk away from this. There's dissenters, there's recluses, there's people who just walk away, deserters. But you pay a price for that. And for a lot of people, it takes they can get close to the norm. And so the promise is held out that if you do this well, if you're a good salesperson, your sales figures will come up, and then you'll be the one getting the vacations. And so there's a real draw to that. And I think one contrast I would make is between being exceptional and being normal. I think systems that promote exceptionalness are a little bit different than systems that promote normality. Normality is about anxiety. Your body type is not right. Your BMI is too high. You are not having a normal, your education is not going well, you're not mentally normal. Whereas exceptional systems do hold out this option of you can exceed in different ways. You can be, and I do think so. There's a struggle in our society between these two sort of be exceptional, be normal, be exceptional, be normal. Obviously, they're not entirely consistent with each other. But I think that the anxiety-producing side of it is the normality. You're not normal. That's where you can see exceptional is more like an aspirational thing, and you can see it produces anxiety and working really hard, overworking, striving too much. But you're not normal. That's anxiety. That pushes a person's button, says, you might be found out. You might be judged to be inadequate. Nobody will love you. You won't be acceptable. You're not normal.
Sounds like normality is also the driver of imposter syndrome, or
imposter syndrome. I guess that would be. Other people are doing this. Why aren't you?
Yeah.
Your colleagues are able to do this. Why can't you do it?
Yeah. And it seems to also be driving a shift in the metrics of normality and how, there's been a lot of advancement in how statistics have changed over the last 150 years and how they're deployed to construct this concept of
Well, I think in what societies consider to be normal, change over time. We can see, for example, a massive change in the treatment of people who are no longer gender typical or who have sexuality that doesn't line up exactly with cisgendered, heterosexuality. That's, as recently as the 80s, and probably even since then, but certainly in the 80s, there were well-publicized cases of, the police beating up gay men just for being gay. People being killed for this. And still to this day, the violence against transgendered people rates are much higher. So there is a threat behind it, but you can also see the standard changing. A single parent family is no longer so stigmatized. A couple that went through a divorce, once upon a time you hid that. I know of cases where, for example, growing up where I did, which is in the United States, a very Catholic part of the country, 50 years ago, a woman got pregnant. She went away to a different city to have that child if she wasn't married, because it was so, stigmatized that you had to hide the fact. And she'd give up the child and come back to her hometown, and the story would be that she was helping an aging aunt who was sick or something like that.
Right.
Because that stigma was so heavy. So I do think there's a way in which our sense of in certain areas, what's normal is being relaxed. There's a broader, but in other areas, what's normal is actually quite restricted. And when I look around me today in Australia, for example, to me, the driving thing is around consumerism. And just, normal is a particular, and there's people are struggling right now, especially in the area of mental health and neurodiversity. So things like, should people who have certain neurological conditions be considered disordered, or are they just a different normal? Right. And that, I think that's a really good discussion to have, because even if you say, look, that's diversity, that doesn't necessarily tell that person how to deal with it. Like, I can realize that I'm quite different, and that's okay, but I still have to learn how to deal with it. Does that mean that I choose a particular life course that's different? Do I choose a different profession? Just saying things are not, it's okay, it's not abnormal. Still, there's more to be done than just that.
What are the skill sets for your particular form of exceptionalism? Have you seen examples of a system where there are good enablers for embracing diversity?
Oh, look, I think the discussion is all around us right now, and we can even see the backlash against it, where there are groups now saying, pushing back against diversity. So in Sydney, where I live, there's the sense in which the diverse city is normal, that people who don't speak English as a first language, that's normal. People who don't look like this, or people who originally came on the first fleets, that Aboriginal people are not abnormal and obsolete and going to disappear, that Asian populations, that they don't need to fully assimilate, that they're cultural. So there's a lot of space for that. Society is changing. But I think in some ways there's this, we liberate certain parts of our lives at the same time that certain other standards are coming down harder and harder. And for example, the effects of social media on children, and the way that normal is being sold in social media is incredibly powerful. And it's not, I talked about systems like, the French military or public schools, but now it's peer groups doing it to each other. And those groups can be just as limiting and just as vigorous in their persecution of the abnormal.
Yeah, it's used as a marker of in-group, out-group.
Absolutely.
Demarcation.
Things like bullying, for example. Bullying often proceeds along the lines of you're not normal, or you're a freak, or you don't belong, you're not like us, you're not one of us, you should aspire to be one of us, but we get to treat you badly until we judge you. Like all that kind of, that's a form, it can be, it's not always, but one of the languages that can get used around that is normal and not normal.
Right. So we've covered off on a lot of different areas about normality.
Yeah.
And we've talked about the statistics, we've talked about normality in relation to education, sex, gender, society. What are the questions you think we should be asking about normality? Well,
look, there's this whole discussion that sort of started in cross-cultural psychology, anthropology, cognitive science, around what are the limits that are generated by our own position in life.
Yeah.
So the fact that so many of us, psychologists, anthropologists, researchers, come from similar backgrounds, how does that affect the way we see the rest of the world? And there's the concept that some researchers came up with is the idea of we are a weird population. We're Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic.
Western, educated, Industrialized,
rich, and democratic.
Right.
So all 5 of these factors, if you look at every psychological study, something like 86%, 85% or something or more are done on subjects who are Western educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. They're weird. That all the studies we have on what's normal in terms of everything from optical illusions, what kind of optical illusions you fall for, to your hormonal profiles over your lifespan, to all sorts of things, are potentially biased by the fact that we know a lot about weird people and we don't know a lot about the rest of the population. And that's over 80% of the population of the planet. We're like, people from 20% of the countries are determining 80 to 90% of the research on what it means to be human. So there's a lot of variation out there. And my concern is that, in a sense, we are limiting what we think is possible as a human because we're only studying this group of people. And I would say Western educated, industrialized, rich, democratic, that's a nice way of seeing how we're different. Another way of seeing how we're different is that we don't know how to produce our own food. We're overly sedentary. We're social media and media addicted. We're exposed. So, the positive spin on it is that we're educated, industrialized, and rich. The negative spin on it is a lot of us know that these lives are really divorced from all kinds of things that people have traditionally been able to do. They've had less material goods. They've had more skills. They've been socially more embedded with each other. So we don't know what that life looks like. I'll give you an example of that. The rates that people talk about, the rates of depression, for example, in Western societies. Now, we don't know if that's actually an effect of Western societies. The way we live might exacerbate certain mental health tendencies, or it may take people who are prone to having a different kind of mood, and it may make it really hard to live with that mood. Maybe depression wouldn't have the same symptoms if you were in a place that didn't expect you to deal with hundreds of people every day. It didn't expect you to get up and go to work, and do these 40-hour weeks. That some of the effects of being not just depressed, but maybe schizophrenic, on the autism spectrum, all kinds of things. It's not just that those conditions exist or don't exist. It's how do they intersect with the society around them and the expectation of normality. That if you expect somebody to be normal and they hear voices, then they need to be institutionalized. Whereas if you live in a society where people hear voices, maybe you've got a talent. Maybe you hear voices and it actually means that somebody's visiting you. Or, maybe it's the ancestors, or maybe it's spirits.
So the experience of depression in one society is different.
Could be.
To the experience in another, or the experience of schizophrenia in one society is embraced in one society, but perhaps...
Yeah, and it still might be difficult to struggle with it. I'm not saying it all is roses, but we do know that for certain mental health diagnoses, the prognosis in Western industrialized societies is actually worse than the prognosis in other societies in terms of whether you'll recover or not. So the sense in which our society may be especially punishing to the abnormal for a lot of reasons. One is because maybe we're more isolated. 2 is because maybe the institutions we have are less tolerant of variation. You can't fail 3rd grade again. You must have some difficulty, so you must get shunted into a class with other difficult to manage kids, which is going to, of course, make your education harder. You're not being, there's lots of ways to think about this. The bottom line is that we know a lot about certain populations, and we think we know what's normal based on them. But not only do we not have a better data set, we just don't know about the diversity, but also we don't know how these conditions interact with other societies so well. And to me, there's a real possibility that there's a significant... And I'll give you one more example in terms of the positive side of things. So I work a lot on skill acquisition with blind people, free divers, things like that. And one of the cases I always give is the marathon. So when I talk to people about diversity, I say, for a long time in Europe, people thought that the marathon distance, which is 46 kilometers or 42 kilometers, 26 miles, in the legend, the soldier ran and passed and died from running it, was considered to be a killing distance. You couldn't run. To run a marathon was dangerous. It could kill you.
Right.
Well, it turned out that's not actually true at all. Not even close. The guy who ran that marathon and died had also just run before that. He had run to Sparta and back to the battlefield, which was 140 kilometers each way through the mountains. Right. Then he fought in a battle, and then he ran back to Athens and died after this marathon distance. So society had been shaped by the expectation that 26 miles will kill you.
Right.
And in fact, what we know now is there's lots of societies where that's not even considered a long run. There's Native American groups, for example, in northern Mexico, the Tarahumara, one of the legendary examples, who, you know, go on village runs where two villages run against each other for hundreds of kilometers. And when they have an ultra marathon, they invited some of these Indians to come run in the ultra marathon, the Leadville Ultra Marathon, and the Native American groups, women went. And people were like, why are there only women here? And they said, well, the Indians said that wasn't a man's distance. That this ultra marathon, which is considered to be so difficult, wasn't even a worthy distance to challenge the whole village. So yes, we'll be polite, we'll send some people, but none of our serious runners are coming.
Wow. So
this is the kind of thing where we don't even know what the limits are. And I'm looking at, for example, like freedivers, or the case that I really love is I work with a colleague named Daniel Kish. He's blind.
Right.
And he teaches flash sonar. He clicks his tongue and he can hear in the echoes, he can hear space, walls, doors. And what's so amazing about Daniel is blind people have been doing this for millennia, using reflected sound to perceive.
Okay.
But when he became aware of it, gave it a name, started to talk about it, suddenly other blind people were like, yeah, I do that too. I thought it was something else. I didn't realize what I was doing. They had been being taught how to get around as blind people by sighted people.
Right.
So they were being told that what's normal for a blind person is you have to have a cane and a dog, and you can't perceive anything more than 5 meters from you.
So in other words, what's normal for a blind person is what a seeing person experiences
when their eyes are blind.
And that was being imposed.
Absolutely. But what it did is it totally shifted what the vision impaired could think of as normal.
When Daniel Kish came in.
When Daniel Kish comes in and says, look, I can walk across a parking lot and perceive the building across the parking lot because I can hear the echoes coming back. And people are like, oh yeah, I can do that too.
And he was doing this with clicking.
With clicking his tongue. For a long time in his life, he didn't even realize he was clicking. Like until he went to university, he didn't realize he was doing it. He was so skilled at it. It's like a skateboarder who doesn't even remember how they skateboard.
Right.
He just knew how to create the sense. And so he didn't even realize what he was doing. So in this case, what was considered normal for a vision impaired person was not actually what they were capable of.
Right.
And we can say the same about women, for example, in society, that the change in women's sports has shown that what was thought to be normal for women. I could give the same example of the first woman to run the Boston Marathon, where she was actually tackled by men on the track because they said, you shouldn't be running this.
Yeah.
And people told her she would damage her ability to reproduce. And this sort of thing is fairly normal. We look at people and we say, oh, it's not normal. It's not normal for an Aboriginal kid to get an education. It's not normal for a Muslim person to be able to do something. It's not normal for a woman to be able to do this, or a child who has this particular cognitive, whether it's Down syndrome or autism spectrum. That we create normal for different categories of people.
There's a few different threads I'm hearing here. One is that there are notions of normality constructed by one group that are imposed onto other groups. And these notions of normality can really cut those groups off at the knees and stop them from embracing their diversity and really finding their exceptionalism and their strengths. Yeah. And the other thread I'm hearing here is the way in which people take completely arbitrary ideas of normality, an idea of normality that hasn't been constructed statistically, but has been constructed simply out of someone's idea of what a woman should be or what a blind person should be, and either self-imposing that or imposing that on other people.
Yeah, there's a real slippage because a lot of norms are ideological. You're exactly right. They come from values. They don't come from an actual picture of what's out there. So, for example, the idea of what a normal family was in the 1950s wasn't based on statistics.
Right.
It was based on an image that was hatched in a particular time and place.
Right.
And in some cases it was hatched intentionally. The case of the normal family, the idea of a stay-at-home mother in a suburban home.
Right.
In the United States, that was created in part to get women to leave the factories because the men were coming back from the war. And they had to get all these women out of these factories and back into the home. Of course, the truth was they hadn't been in the home before that either, that women had been involved in work, especially working class women. Poor women had always worked. Housekeepers, making clothing, laundress, all these sorts of things. But, the normal in that case was actually a complete figment of the marketers' imaginations.
But then when you then take statistics and measure these newly constructed normal families, then you are constructing a new set of statistics that are actually hiding hidden ideologies that have been behind the scenes.
There's a lot of that where you're right. The idea of normal can hide what I'm really telling you is what I want you to do.
Right.
Oh no, this is what's normal. It sort of makes it as though I'm just statistically telling you that most women do X.
Right. Yeah.
When in fact, the subtext is I'm trying to tell you what to do.
It sounds objective.
Yeah.
It sounds like, I'm just referring to something out there in the real world.
Just the reality.
When really it's hiding an ideology.
Yeah. And I think that happens a lot around these sorts of things like gender norms and like sexuality stuff. I mean, one of the things about the internet, the explosion of different groups, is people have realized that stuff that they thought was really weird, there's actually other people out there thinking it too.
Right.
This is the secret, I thought I was abnormal. It turns out there's a lot of us. Like the idea that when these groups find each other, they're like, oh, wait a minute. There's actually a lot of people who feel this way. There's a lot of people who are like me, and so I'm not so alone. Again, it still doesn't necessarily tell you how to treat it, but it does give you people to talk to. It does give you other role models. To be vision impaired is still challenging, but to see Daniel Kish or to hear about what Daniel Kish is doing offers other opportunities and other options to people.
There seems to be a possibility of creating networks that empower people to step away from these self-limiting beliefs. So I asked the question, what questions we should ask about normality, but maybe I should be asking, how should we challenge normality, and what do you think we should? What do you think we should be doing to challenge normality?
And what's the price we pay for this idea of normal? And what's the price we pay for striving to be normal? There's a cost to this.
Yeah. What is the price of normality, and what is the price of believing in normality, and what costs are we paying in paying tribute?
I mean, it's a simple thing like, does it make it worse to struggle with, say, for example, a mental illness if you have this idea of normal hovering over you, chastising you, instead of saying, look, it's actually fairly common for people to go through different phases in their life where they have different moods, and that it's doesn't make you damaged, it doesn't make you irredeemable to go through this, nor does it mean your life is going to be meaningless, even if you never recover.
Yeah, right.
And I think there's a price we pay individually, and there's a price we pay as a society for this.
And not necessarily just in economic terms, but also in
emotional, spiritual, health, well-being. Yeah.
Right. Professor Greg Downey, thank you so much for being with us and sharing just the tip of the iceberg of your thoughts and beliefs on normality and how we should be challenging this concept, how we should be thinking about it. Really value your time.
Thanks, Paul.